Today, I want to talk to you about Plato's Republic, Book 10. Of course, the final book of the Republic, and it has some final messages from Plato. There are two basic parts of the book that I'm going to talk about today. First, his remarks about art and aesthetics, which I think are misunderstood. So I think that's an interesting and important part of Plato. And then the Republic as a whole closes with the myth of air, which is a beautiful and fascinating piece of ancient literature that we will look at. So let's go straight to that then. PowerPoint. Here we go. Right. Plato Republic 10. Art and Reincarnation. The Book of Air is a story about reincarnation, and I'm going to stress its commonalities with our axial age sources. But first, we want to talk about art. A main criticism of Plato is that Plato is against artists. Plato wants to ban the poets. Some of that is structural. Let me step out of this for a second. That is the Homeric tradition, which Plato sees as a uncivilized, undisciplined folk tradition that has unhealthy excesses of materialism and irrational passions and poor personal characters, notably of the gods and so on. So he is against that tradition. So that's one reason which he's frankly against the poets. But I think we can go a little bit farther than that. And I want to make a larger point that I don't think he's really quite as bad about art in general as people think. I think he's a fascinating thinker about art. So let's take a look at that. When I say final thoughts on art, that is his final thoughts on art. The initial discussion of art in the Republic is in Book 3, and then here he comes back having made all the teachings that he's made in the book and makes some final remarks about art. First of all, sort of picking up on the remarks about art and aesthetics I wanted to make in Book 3, to say that Plato is anti-art is, I think, a pretty big mistake. It's certainly not. It's an ungenerous reading, but to the point where the person with the interpretation is kind of fooling themselves. Plato is very much pro-art. There are only certain kinds of art that he worries about, and these aren't just certain kinds of art. These are actually certain kinds of activities that he doesn't think it's a good idea for human beings to be doing. And so, first bullet points, wrong to say this is anti-art. Everything will be done as well as possible. Remember, he is very much an idealist, especially here in this sort of thought experiment of the Republic that he has, of course, about human capacities and what really well high functioning human beings would be able to do, the kinds of things that they'd be able to do. And they wouldn't do anything halfway. I mean, what Plato and his spiritual hero, if you will, in this context, Socrates, what they have in common is they have a very high value on authenticity and on action and against artifice and passivity. So, second bullet point, in the authentically lived, maximally rational life, art disappears as a separate category of human activities or objects and characterizes all forward motion and production. It is all artful. It is all high quality. To be artful is precisely to be authentic and original. And by the way, and this is something we talked about in the very controversial Book 5, in the discussion of the very controversial Book 5 of the Republic, for Plato, absolutely the personal is the political and the political is the personal. He very much has this totalizing picture of that a lot of modern social and political thinkers also do. And this is an example of that. You don't have some sort of category of art that then is categorized off from the rest of your life. All of your life is imbued with these basic principles: the dedication to the rational part of reality and the concomitant dedication to beauty, for example, but also to good citizenship. So what kind of art doesn't he like? Because he does have some very blanket prohibitions proposed for his imaginary Callipolis about art. So let's look at that third bullet point. What is not real art, he thinks, is imitation, mimesis, which is a withdrawal. Let me explain it just for a second. We're going to talk about it more in the next couple slides. That is a movement away from reality. So you've got the actual original thing, and then you've got sort of a copy of it. And that happens, remember, again, that happens in the development of the human soul. It happens in the emergence and the becoming and passing away of objects in the world and the physical world itself. It's all part of the same picture. Um, so these activities are following the downward path away from the rational realization of self. Ornamentation, of course, is also falling down into sensuality. It's exciting the passions for their own sake. And that's not something that you would do. Think like form follows function, like Swedish furniture kind of a thing. I mean, that's sort of the implied aesthetic here. But there certainly is a very demanding aesthetic here, and one that would be very beautiful to see, too, in this imaginary Callipolis, where everything was fashioned with maximum ergonomics and maximum efficiency and maximum artfulness. Artfulness is just the right word to use there. Again, the art that he doesn't want is imitation. And again, one's own life ought not to be an imitation of others either. You really wouldn't like something like television where people are sort of learning how to live by watching these characters. But he acknowledges the siren call of body. And again, he does it both in this aesthetic analysis and in his political analysis, because this is what he's talking about when he talks about the charms of democracy. So let's go over this. The first bullet point, the act of mimesis itself is an example of the soul disintegrating into matter. It's the soul fading away from authentic form and into material forms of mimesis. That's why in book 3, there's I like to dwell on it because it's a little bit strange. It's a little bit neurotic. I don't know. That is, Socrates says, don't imitate animals. Don't go like a sheep or like a horse or things. Don't go boing like a spring or like a squeaky hinge. He says, don't do that stuff. It's bad for you because you're sort of losing your real being and falling down into materiality. At that point, that sounds, like I said, kind of nutty, right? But that's the thing. It is a kind of authenticity fetish. One doesn't necessarily feel compelled to run along after Plato and Socrates with this and say, oh yeah, you're right. And in fact, and we talk about this he talks about this in a few different places in his writings. Notably the Cratylus, which is about language and the relationship between words and the meanings of the words. Socrates prefers speech to writing. He doesn't want to write things down. Socrates, the real Socrates, leaves us no written record, although he lived his life among these academics who wrote a great deal. The written word was certainly part of their intellectual culture, but Socrates left no writings behind, because Socrates argued that you had to really do philosophy, you had to do it face to face with another rational person. The picture seems to be that he has that writing in symbols is yet another remove, yet another level of imitation. So it's actually going farther away from something that's authentically real from human speech. Second bullet point, the material part of our soul is, that we are body. That's us in the world of the many. And the world of the many is the world of contingency and variety. And it's so fascinating. Other people fascinate us so much in all their variety and in all their contingencies. The contingent uniqueness of the individual is more interesting than our shared rationality, he admits here. He says, in a play, you have all these interesting characters and they have all their faults and they have all their virtues. And that's what's interesting about them, all the differences between them. And to emphasize their shared rationality, which he thinks is the right move, both in terms of evolving politically and evolving aesthetically. He says, of course, that's never going to be as interesting. That's going to be dull compared to celebrating the colorful proliferation of variety that is democracy. So, and again, why go on about it like that? Precisely because it's this form of social being that is passionate. Glaucon, the sensualist, remember, this is sort of the whole argument Yeah, the basic argument of the book that's set up by Thrasymachus and then the brothers Glaucon and Adimantus in book one, end of book one, beginning of book two, is to show Job like that the just man, even though he has no material value at all, is happier than the unjust man, even if the unjust man has every material wish fulfilled. Uh, the wise man versus the tyrant. And the argument, of course, as you know now, is that the parts of soul are in the right arrangement. The right arrangement is the rational part, being in control of the passionate part through the exercise, the discipline, of course. And if that's accepted as the right description of a healthy human psychology, then indeed it does follow that the just man is happier than the unjust man, because the unjust man is, in that sense, not sane. You see. Um, so but the problem, the technical problem, so in book nine, that's settled. But remember Glaucon's problem. Glaucon, the young man, well-intentioned, but he's a lover of pleasure. He's a man in his body. He likes to go to the dances. He loves music. Um, when you talk to him about goodness, and this is a big substantial part of the whole discussion of the Republic, right, is the theory of value. Plato thinks that value comes from the transcendental good, which is organizing the world into an intelligible place. He thinks that's the only source of value. But a lot of more ordinary people, more in their bodies, I guess, like Glaucon would tell you, well, isn't pleasure some kind of affective state of the body? Like, isn't pleasure something like a soft surface or the way I feel when I'm exercising or compelling music? I understand what you mean by pleasure. It's a hedonistic right, hedonistic notion. In this case, in the context of Plato's theory of value, hedonistic notion in the sense that values are based in or sourced in, or to some extent based or sourced in the passions of the body. What Plato denies, what the modern period embraces, but what Plato denies. It is this attitude towards aesthetics that drives the interpretation that Plato is anti-art. If one thinks that art just is mimesis in the context of material contingency and variety, like impressionist art, I'm going to make a beautiful painting because of the experience that I'm having looking at the scene. And if that's just your notion of what art sort of is, his notion of art is a much more totalizing notion. And really, your whole, as they say, the personal is political, the personal is aesthetic, and your whole life should really be a sort of work of art. And which isn't such a terrible thing to say, although it certainly is an idealist thing to say, isn't it? Now, about this table, and table is the example that Plato uses in book 10. And he's just talking about these degrees of reality. Remember, he thinks everything in existence, including what we would call physical things, including what we would call mental things, including what we would call selves, everything in existence comes to be and passes away through this kind of tidal pull of the form on the matter, according to Plato, really without exception. He talks about Plato. He talks about the table. You have a drawing of a table. That's a copy of a table, which is a copy of the idea of the table. Let me read out the first bullet point. A drawing of a table is a copy of an artifactual table, which is a copy of the form of table. Right, this is sort of the rhetoric of explaining the forms. And so the drawing is twice removed from reality. That's the idea. You have these degrees of reality, and each lower level is a copy of the one above it. Of course, your thought of the drawing is a further remove. I can imagine the drawing of the table. And so the point being that there's further removes. This is not a finite sort of spectrum of coming to be and passing away. It passes away, it keeps passing away into chaos. And interestingly, there are higher levels of being on this view as well, as I will explain right now. Second bullet point, there's a continuum of formal realization of becoming as well. Now notice this is sort of maybe the most important point on this slide here. The Platonic table would be described functionally. The table is a thing that holds things up, say. So notice that a functional description, a description in terms of functions, just is a description that abstracts away from specific contingent hardwares. There are many, many different things could be a table. So when you say that the carpenter's table is a copy of sort of the form of table, that's, people will put in their minds a little blueprint with a little, measured off table picture in the middle of it or something, and that's supposed to be the idea. They have an idea of a table. What there is the function of holding something up. And that's the universal. The universal is functional because the world is a functional place. It makes sense. Remember, Plato endorses the design argument for the craftsman being the universal, intentional being. Um, so, so also notice that the notion of the form. Let me read the last bullet point. Nor is there some quasi-spatial Platonic space where there exists a plurality of forms. I mean, if we're teaching about Plato on a two-dimensional surface like a blackboard, we're going to have the forms above and the matter below. But that's just a schematic. The forms aren't located in. There's only, first of all, there's only one form. So you say, I'm having an idea because I'm doing philosophy right now about if I were remembering, so that would be a remembered image, this picture that I saw of a table that someone built, thinking about what they needed in a table, and that would be this sort of form of table. But really, then that form of table is just part of this general logical structure of the world, which is a oneness and not a whole made out of parts, but an indivisible oneness. So, so even that form of table is yet another. There's another step of being up above that. But even that step of being, the step where you say, well, there is a good, which is sort of making the world into an intelligible place. But then that too may be a representation of what he's calling the craftsman, which is what he thinks the intentional being of the universe is. So there's further levels of being up and down. It's not a sort of three-step or four-step schemata of being. It's an open-ended continuum of coming to be and passing away. Now, the thing about art too, I mean, mostly notice when he talks about art, representational art and why it's bad for you, he's really mostly addressing the artist or the actor, say, or the person in general, sort of falling down into mimesis, saying you shouldn't do it because it's bad for you. So one of the main reasons he wants to ban art is because he thinks the people practicing the art are being damaged by doing this. But of course, then he also wonders about the larger social implications of these influences, and he's very strict. But look, on this view where authenticity is kind of, frankly, the sort of aesthetic fetish, right? You want to be authentic above all. Then on that level, then just passivity itself, just the notion of a passive spectator or consumer of art, someone who has an attitude that they're going to adopt a passive position in order to appreciate something else, even that is called into question by this very rigorous authenticity aesthetic of Socrates and Plato, I think. If mimesis and sensuality are unhealthy for the artist, they're doubly so for the impressionable audience. Once introduced to these disintegrating states of being, people will tend to imitate them themselves. And passivity itself. So the first point there, they'll start to imitate these things themselves. And we already saw that he's even really, not only should you not be acting like a bad character, or like a bad guy that you saw in a TV show, but you should be acting like an animal or an inanimate object either. And then the on that first bullet point, the last sentence, passivity itself is a form of disintegration after all, because form is movement. Remember, thought is movement. Thought moves forward. Thought doesn't stand still. And so the rational element is not inert; it never stands still. So so stopping is not a good idea. Now Aristotle thinks, as he explains to us in the Poetics, he gives us his notion, his famous notion of catharsis, and he says that what's happening is ordinary people who don't do a lot of getting in life and death situations or terribly tragic situations, but when they go to the theater and they're exposed to these situations, that's when they're able to sort of practice what they would do, and it helps in their evolution as sort of emotionally fluid beings. So that's what Aristotle thinks. He sees a positive function in art that way. Plato thinks it's too dangerous to mess around with, and I think he might say that there's already too much influence coming from the passions without adding some more on, or something like that. Anyway, getting back to this down with the audience idea on the last bullet point on the slide, Socrates, Plato's avatar of authenticity, rejects the idea that people should willingly subject themselves to mimetic influences. Again, it would be very much against television, where people are watching it and getting all this influence, learning how to be. This is to reject the concept of the audience, the concept of passivity. Don't be a spectator. I mean, that's kind of implicit in this whole aesthetic of active authenticity. It's a Stoic aesthetic, you know. I mean, Socrates is a kind of Greek Stoic, really, and in addition to being this major influence on Plato. So finally, then, if that's a sort of technical story about aesthetics from the first part of the book 10, and then it ends with this very beautiful myth of really suggests reading it over carefully. The Republic ends with Socrates recounting the myth of which tells the story of a fallen soldier who returns from the afterlife with a message for humankind. The myth of is a second bullet point, is a gem of axial age thinking, remarkably consistent with Hindu and Buddhist teachings of the upward and downward progress of souls on the wheel of karma. In fact, nowadays modern scholarship is arguing back and forth about both directions of influence there, as well as recognizably the story of death and return, familiar to post-Bronze Age mythology, Demeter, Egyptian mythology of Anubis, and Moses and the bulrushes and the second coming of Christ, and all the rest of it is a completely, clearly part of that tradition that comes out of Bronze Age mythology. So, and written by Plato around the first half of the 4th century BCE. So it's Providence where he's getting these ideas. I mean, clearly these are very much universal ideas. But it's just fascinating that this writer, Plato, at that time is relating this to us. And what I want to emphasize too, I mean, if I want to emphasize in the first part about aesthetics, it's really not fair to say he's anti-art. That's a real simplification of what's actually an interesting discussion about value. And in the second part, I want to say that this myth of is very much part of this axial age thinking, notably recognizably similar to the wheel of karma model that we get from Indian philosophy. Third bullet point, in the state between embodiments, in Tibetan Buddhism we call that the bardo, and it's in this myth of souls choose their next life, as direct a representation of karma as possible. Souls too lost in materialism will choose to be animals, for example, or live tyrannic or democratic or timarchic lives of people who love honor. Wise souls will choose material peace and simplicity, or ataraxia, again, another Stoic notion. This is the transcendence of the material self, notice, as Plato teaches the transcendence of the contingent self into necessary being characterized by mathematics. Okay, and then the last bullet point, returns to earth to spread the good word. He saw, and he's come back to give us his message and help other beings overcome suffering, as the Buddha returned into the world of samsara to work for the elimination of suffering of all sentient beings. So just an amazing passage from Plato, not only in its aptness, but in what it tells us about some of his intellectual affiliations. And you also just wonder the tradition where this comes from, a rich mythological tradition, most of which is lost to us, but we have elements and evidence of it. All right. Here's an excerpt, and then we're done. The one who came up first chose the greatest tyranny, the one who came up to choose their first life. In his folly and greed, he chose it without imagination. When he examined the life he had chosen, however, he bemoaned his choice. He blamed chance, daemons, and everything else for these evils but himself. He was one who had come down from above. There's a movement upwards and downwards, having lived his life under an orderly constitution where he participated in virtue through habit. Most of those who were caught up in this way were souls who had come down and were untrained in suffering. The majority of souls who had come up from below, having known suffering, were in no rush to make their choices. For most souls, this is an interchange of good and evil, like for like. But the soul that has pursued philosophy will be happy in this life and will not travel the rough underground path, but along the smooth heavenly one. The first noble truth is that all life is suffering. Um, the third noble truth is that we can make progress on the Bodhi path in this lifetime to alleviate our suffering if we follow the teachings. So, um, all right. So, book 10 of the Republic, just a really, really beautiful book. I always make sure to continuously remind everyone that, among other things, when we look at the Republic, we're very much looking at a work of literature. I mean, it's been sort of appropriated by philosophy for obvious reasons. It's a philosophical work in many, many ways, but it is also a work of literature with an interesting structure, um, and a writer's composition. Plato's guiding metaphor for himself as an artist is a weaver, and his weave is very tight. And so the Republic bears that kind of study as well. All right, so I hope then we have some more stuff to think about, and this will then close out my discussion of the 10 books of the Republic. So thanks for anyone who's participated or, paid me any attention to looking at any of that. Thank you again. Okay, bye-bye. If it'll it's not gonna, okay. I'll have to keep thinking. I'll have to try and cut it off.